When I got my NES in 1986, it was love at first sight. While I had played it before at various friends' houses, there was nothing quite like owning my own. Those 3 years I had supported it were mostly spectacular, loaded with unforgettable classics. Between Capcom, Konami, and Nintendo themselves, there was no shortage of memorable software to play. But like a lot of kids back then, much of my NES experience was based on trading games with friends and classmates. Since games were typically $30 to $50 at launch, it was commonplace to barter your titles around pretty regularly. This practice sometimes benefited you and sometimes left you with a dud you couldn't wait to get rid of. There was nothing worse than getting saddled with a game nobody else wanted because it meant trading up was going to be that much tougher. And that there is the very topic of this episode. We are going to go over some of my least liked NES software. These are either games I got stuck with that I ended up hating, or a few I discovered years later only to be shocked at how bad they were. These come in no particular order, but were all extremely unpleasant experiences, both back then and today. We've got 10 games to go over, so let's get started. When I got access to the internet in the late 1990s, it opened up a new world of games I had never known existed. While I was well aware of Aladdin on the Genesis and Super Nintendo, I had no idea there was one made for the NES. This one hit a few PAL territories and was published by Virgin Games and developed by NMS Software. It was one of the few PAL titles I imported when I began collecting games back then, and it was a disaster start to finish. It takes some of the design elements of the Genesis game and attempts to make a playable 8-bit adventure, but it falls well short of anything close to that. I honestly couldn't believe the state of this thing. The gameplay was floaty to the point of feeling like you were on the moon. The sprite hit detection was all over the place. Sprite flicker was rampant. The color use is a joke. It felt like some basement-dwelling bootlegger sloppily ported over the Game Boy code for a pirate release. I mean, the NES is home to some excellent Disney games that make this pile of trash feel like an unfinished beta. Virgin Games usually had enough self-respect to make sure the games it published held a certain quality, but it's clear this garbage was pushed out the door to score a quick buck. I can tolerate this for a few levels before my own self-respect kicks in and I realize what a complete waste of time it is. I can't imagine the developers felt good about pushing this out the door, and the thousands of children they disappointed. It's not often I tell you a game has virtually no positives worth mentioning, but Aladdin on the NES is a failure of monumental proportions. Another discovery of mine thanks to the early days of the internet was the Japanese Famicom exclusive Transformers Mystery of Convoy. To put my expectations into focus here, I was a major Transformers fan as a kid. I didn't get many of the toys, but what I had, I cherished, and the thought of a video game based on that was truly tantalizing. Well, that is before I actually played it. This was published by Takara in 1986, and is easily one of the most disappointing finds I've ever had. Good lord, what were the developers thinking? Right from jump, this is broken at every level. The visuals suck, the weapons you have are utterly useless, you can only take a single hit, and enemies spawn one after the other incessantly. It even has enemies you can't destroy. I mean, when you knock the planes out of the sky, your standard weapon shoots over the head of the resulting enemies. That's right, you have to transform to hit half the enemies in the game. And you would have thought they would have designed a game around using multiple Transformers, right? Not so, as the vast majority of the game is centered on Ultra Magnus. I can't stomach this for more than a few minutes, and have never seen anything past the first few stages. This is the worst example of a license cash-in I've ever seen, and a disgrace to the Transformers name. To put into perspective how bad this game is, and the profoundly negative experience I had with it, there was another Transformers game released a year later on the Famicom Disk System called The Headmasters, and 20 plus years later, I still haven't played it. Superhero video games were some of my favorite games on the NES. I mean, Batman is still up there as one of the best. But when I encountered Kemco's 1988 release of Superman, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I knew this was gonna be rough because the chibi art style doesn't fit this universe at all. How can you take Superman seriously looking like this? To make matters worse, every enemy in the game can damage you with basic attacks, so you never feel like Superman at any point. Maybe you are thinking your powers can save the day. Nope, each of the powers you can choose gets used up fast and you have to collect icons to use them again. But it's the gameplay that just breaks down to pure tedium. Take a look at the slow-mo playback of the hit detection in this stinker. It's literally 2 inches outside of the sprite. Just what the hell happened during the playtest sessions? Did no one speak up and ask why hitting nothing but air somehow translated to damaging the person nearby? With the problems mounting to the point of not wanting to play this after only a few minutes, things just kept getting worse. Enemies don't just drop helpful items, but most of the time you get stuff that will hurt you. And even when something helpful does pop out, it floats away from you and off the screen while you are dealing with the other enemies. The story interactions just pad out the frustration and broken gameplay. Making a Superman game isn't easy, but this here was just about the worst way to go about doing it. I discovered Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade well into owning my Genesis, so I was never gonna see it as anything special or impressive. But even with that said, I wanted this to be better than what we have here. Think of this as a kind of a choose-your-own-adventure thing. You get choices as to where to go and what to take care of. Some of the gameplay is puzzle-based and is pretty straightforward. Cinematics are true to the film, but it's the combat that made me hate this with a passion. Each encounter is just wailing back and forth on one another with punches and kicks. This plays out in the combat scenarios to the point where you just want to put the controller down. I was a fan of the film and consider it a bona fide classic in every sense of the term. It deserved better than this. The thing is, the different puzzles, the choices you can make, and the overall faithfulness to the story created a solid foundation for something that may have worked if the combat wasn't so terribly repetitive. It isn't a long game either, so you'll be replaying these areas over and over before getting a shot at the final stretch. It's not the worst movie game you'll ever play, but I still wasted enough time on it to earn it quite a bit of disdain. As I've mentioned before on my channel, I only got a handful of new games for the NES over the course of the time I owned it. I got lucky with a few like Rygar, but I ran headlong into the garbage known as Deadly Towers with absolutely no knowledge of just how bad it was. There are some that will tell you this is a deep and complex adventure, especially for a 1987 release. But what I found was a woefully designed title that did not give you the tools you needed to be successful, leading to an opening that gives you nothing but bad feelings. You are so incredibly weak to start. These bad guys spawn in massive groups, and some take way too many hits to defeat. You start out by only being able to throw one projectile at a time, and can't throw another until it leaves the screen. Worse, sometimes you get an enemy that hits you right in the perfect spot when you first enter a room, and kills you instantly, leading to a restart that shatters your will to keep playing it. The setup is sound enough. Enter the Deadly Towers, defeat the boss, and move on to the next. Each tower is non-linear and has multiple rooms to explore. But this is not Legend of Zelda caliber game design. This is set up so you are guaranteed to fail and need to restart countless times as you suffer its cruel and malicious intentions. There may be something deeper here for those willing to follow a guide and deal with this setup, but anyone hoping for a completely organic experience will walk away with nothing but a feeling of helplessness and ultimately defeat as you turn away and never want to touch it again. In 1991, I found RoboCop II on the NES and was ready for a run-and-gun ass-kicking sci-fi adventure. What I got instead was a game that played like you were slipping around on ice constantly and loaded with enemies that were far more capable than you at getting the job done. RoboCop also looked extremely silly in this game, kinda like Hank Hill's dad Cotton in the old King of the Hill animated show. I mean, where are the rest of his legs at? You look silly, and it's difficult to take the game seriously when the visual representation of the hero is so compromised. But as usual, it's the gameplay that's the biggest issue here. That previously mentioned ice feels like it's on every surface. RoboCop will move an additional inch or so whenever you stop or try and jump, leading to falling into pits or taking damage at the worst of times. Nothing feels exact or accurate when you move around, and this feeling never lets up and never resolves itself with additional playtime. And there are many platforming segments throughout the stages, so expect death to come at the worst of times, and it's often not your fault. I also felt the level design was ludicrous for a RoboCop title. I mean, this is old Detroit, but you are jumping around mostly abstract warehouses that look like something out of a Futurama episode. Nothing fits. The sprite is wrong, the stages are wrong, the gameplay is wrong. I wasn't expecting anything to rival Contra or anything, but I was hoping for more than this. With the Genesis lacking a RoboCop to call its own at the time, I only had this as an alternative. I just wish I had known then what I know now. Almost everyone remembers Mike Tyson's Punch-Out! What a game! That gameplay, those visuals, that soundtrack, I mean, it was nothing short of a perfect title. So when Power Punch 2 showed up in 1992, I was expecting something similar based on the pictures I had seen. I mean, this looks like Punch-Out!, right? Well, any similarities to Punch-Out! Begins and ends with the presentation. Yes, it has a similar viewpoint, and yes, many of the core play mechanics resemble it, but nothing here is in the same league as the Nintendo Classic. The design of the aliens fall well short of the memorable foes you faced in Punch-Out! The gameplay in Punch-Out! Was also laser focused and nearly surgical in its exactness, the complete opposite of the fumbling mediocrity you'll find in Punch-Out! 2. As the story goes, Nintendo had originally meant for this to be a new Mike Tyson's game where Iron Mike would challenge various types of aliens, but the boxer's legal troubles led them to bowing out before its completion. Beam Software then rewrote the script and found a new publisher. I personally feel Nintendo abandoned ship because they saw the quality of this pile of crap wasn't getting any better and didn't want their name anywhere near it. The funny thing was, these disingenuous bastards had the balls to call it Power Punch 2 to make kids think it was a sequel to Punch-Out!, despite the fact there was never a Power Punch 1. I can't imagine how many youngsters fell for this ploy and ended up with this nightmare of a game. All involved should be ashamed of themselves, including Nintendo, for allowing their seal of quality to appear on it. When I was a youngster, I adored Swamp Thing, both the comic and the campy Wes Craven movie starring Adrienne Barbeau. So in 1992, I was eager to give the NES game a go. What we have here is easily one of the dullest, most unexciting titles you could ever play. Swamp Thing is let loose in drab environments and gets to punch ho-hum enemies like robot animals. But the joke's on you because your punch is so completely ineffective that it's best just to run from everything. And that's exactly what this game is all about. Here we have one of DC's most powerful and unique characters, and all you do is run away 95% of the time. There is also inexplicable things happening, like tin cans falling from the sky that can actually kill you. I honestly don't know what else to say about this dud. It misses the mark so far with this IP, you have to wonder if the developers at Imagineering actually knew anything about the source material at all. Had they even seen the comic book featuring this character? I've wanted a video game covering Swamp Thing for years because so far, no studio has even come close to doing him any justice at all. Karate Champ was something of an enigma in the arcade, and the NES version was even more of a pain. There are many out there that will heap praise on this for its innovative gameplay style and number of moves. Not me though. This game plays terribly no matter how different it was from the stuff available at the time. Hit detection is completely random. You can have punches and kicks hit square in the center of the fighter, and yet the match goes on with no points added. It's not that the game is difficult. It isn't at all. It's just that your success feels so random and unfocused. I don't know, I just never felt this played well enough to get the praise some people give it. It's true it was a pioneer in the one-on-one fighting game genre, but when it comes to mechanics that rewarded you for nailing a perfect move at the right time, I never got a sense that this was rewarding me for anything other than getting lucky. It isn't a bad looking title in terms of the fighters and animation, but the backgrounds are certainly not the best the hardware could pull off, nor is there any real variety in the personalities you face. Fighting games have certainly evolved a long way since this was released by Data East in 1986, but even back then something was missing and unsatisfying about it. Yar Kung Fu was much more fun in my opinion. As much as I disliked Karate Champ on the NES, it was a masterpiece next to the Nintendo-made Urban Champion. I hadn't owned an NES for very long when a good friend of mine, Jerry, spoke of its incredible fight model and cool graphics and sound. I only had a few games at that time, so I traded him my beloved pro wrestling for it, hoping the new style of fighting would equal just how great pro wrestling had been. And boy did I get taken as a sucker, because Urban Champion was a turd from the moment I fired it up. Initially I thought it didn't look bad at all, but that was only until I realized the visuals never really changed. Same locations, same two fighters, same animations for its woefully limited gameplay. That gameplay is painfully simple too. You get a couple of face punches based on power, and a couple of body blows that account for everything you can do. Jabs are quick and easy, while the power blows are slower and easier to avoid. The object is to keep knocking your foe back until he falls into a manhole in the street. And that goes on and on for what amounts to 135 fights. That's right, Nintendo fans, this game expects you to stick around for that long when the gameplay is this repetitive. I grew weary of this one in record time and had a heck of a problem getting rid of it. If you are still out there, Jerry, I want you to know I have never forgiven you for this dud, and I still want my pro wrestling back. Expectation is a huge part of playing video games. You can go into something you've never heard of before, have a bad time, and think nothing of it. But it's when you go into the games you want it to be special, or were based on some property that you held dear, that you feel the most burned by. Movies, comic books, arcade ports, it was games based on these things that often gave you the biggest emotional response. When a game got it right, you were happy to see it. And when it got it so very wrong, you couldn't help but walk away disappointed that it failed so hard. It was also terrible to spend your hard-earned money on something that didn't pan out. It was even worse when you didn't get new games from your parents but once in a blue moon, only to be stuck with a stinker. Some of us would sit and play these games until we found the good in them, while others would simply trade them away for some other poor kid to suffer. That was the ebb and flow of video games back then. A give and take system of trying your best to score the games worth your time and frantically attempting to avoid the ones that wasted it. If you guys enjoyed this episode and would like me to tackle this subject again, let me know down in the comments. The NES library was fairly large and I have plenty more games I could add to this list. For every Mario, Zelda, Castlevania, and Contra, there was easily multiple games you wanted to avoid. That was certainly the quagmire of owning a successful platform. You got a number of unmissable classics, but you also got a pile of time-wasting garbage as well. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.